The $7.4 billion settlement with Purdue Pharma was approved by a federal judge today. Now local governments will vote on whether to sign onto the deal. The maker of OxyContin is accused of fueling the country's opioid overdose epidemic. For tonight's interview, we are joined by CBS Medical contributor Dr. Celine Gounder. Dr. Gounder, what are the details of this settlement?
This is a nationwide settlement involving 49 states, the District of Columbia, and 5 U.S. territories. So basically everybody except Oklahoma, which had its own settlement deal. The Sackler family, which owned Purdue Pharma, they themselves are responsible for covering $6.5 billion of the 7.4 billion total. And then Purdue Pharma, the actual company, is responsible for $900 million of that settlement. So some of that money will go to families and victims to compensate them for the costs of addiction and death, unfortunately, in some cases. And then some of that money will go to state, local, and tribal governments. And they are supposed to spend that money on public health, prevention, treatment services to address addiction and overdose.
What's been the obstacle to getting this far so far?
So the big sticking point has been legal immunity. So the Supreme Court rejected the original settlement deal because that would have shielded the Sackler family from other lawsuits, including from victims. So that forced a renegotiation of the settlement.
So then they can still be held liable in other cases then?
That is true.
So what's the history or the lesson from, say, tobacco settlements, some of these other settlements in the past, how they've worked?
Yeah, and I think we really have to remember that history. So the 1998 Master Tobacco Settlement Agreement, which was for a much larger amount, almost $250 billion, so almost 30 times as large as what we're talking about now for opioids. Most of that money did not go towards smoking prevention or public health. A lot of that money was used by many states just to plug budget holes, to fund unrelated projects. And so there really needs to be accountability. And some of my colleagues at KFF Health News have been documenting with some of the prior opioid-related lawsuits that indeed we're already seeing that money not being spent on the very programs it is supposed to be spent on.
Where are we, by the way, on the question of overdose deaths and the conditions that were underlying all of this?
Well, we did see overdose deaths peak at about 100,000 deaths per year in the United States. That decline has been starting over the last couple of years since the pandemic. Some of the reasons for that: naloxone, which is a medication to reverse an overdose, fentanyl test strips so people can test their drugs for whether there's fentanyl in them, and then more aggressive law enforcement over the last several years has resulted in seizures where you have less fentanyl entering the drug supply.
And what about then on what OxyContin was supposed to do? Like, remind us about how pain is now managed, and are there drugs like this still that can be in the medical process? Yeah,
I mean, I think back to when I started medical school in 2000. At that time, we were carrying pagers, and I felt like we were being paged as if we were drug dealers. That was sort of the expectation, that you were giving them OxyContin. And I think I and many other young practitioners were very concerned by the trends we were observing. I think since then we have understood that overprescribing is really dangerous, that these drugs can be very addictive. And so as a result, providers are much more cautious in how they prescribed. And the FDA is now encouraging alternatives, recently having approved non-opioid medication for pain.